You're listening to Watchman Internet Radio. My name is Robert King. It is Saturday 19 in the year 2019. I call myself Watchman or E-Watchman because that's a biblical designation. God appointed Ezekiel as a watchman and commanded him certain things that he must speak to his fellow Israelites. Well, God doesn't speak to me. I want to assure you of that. I don't hear a little voice. But the watchtower itself claims to be a watchman. In fact, it claims to be a prophet. It takes to itself such titles as the Ezekiel class, the Jeremiah class, the Micah class, and so on and so on. It claims to be God's spokesman, which is rather odd, seeing that if God has issues with the leadership, how will they announce those judgments? As in the case of ancient Israel and Judah, God used men who were Israelites, but who stood aside from the hierarchy, from the kings and princes and priests, although some of the prophets were themselves priests. But they were not part of the establishment, you might say. They were, in fact, outcasts. And so in that respect, as I say, I don't hear little voices, but I do hear God's word. And I apply it in a particular way, and I direct it to a particular group of men, which is what I've been doing for the past 20 years, calling the Watchtower to account based upon God's Word and based upon what I know to be the wrongdoings that are taking place, which is what the original Watchman did. I'm not going to read today's daily text. It's taken from Zechariah and an article the Watchtower had written concerning that entire book. It's come to be, though, that in recent years, the Watchtower, they still want to project themselves as this watchman and this prophet, but they've completely watered down the prophecies. And that's apparent in their latest expose, or if you want to call it that, commentary. I don't even think it qualifies as that, on the book of Ezekiel. But in today's daily text, they quoted from the 23rd chapter of Jeremiah about a king reigning, a sprout, and he will show insight and uphold justice and righteousness in the land, and in his days, Judah will be saved. Well, that is a messianic prophecy for sure, and we appreciate it has to do with the second coming of Jesus Christ, and Judah and Israel represent those who are in the new covenant, And Jerusalem, of course, represents Christ's congregation, which, as I've mentioned many times, Christianity originated in the city of Jerusalem. It had this long storied history for 1,500 years, or 1,000 years at least, before Christ. And so it became this symbol of Christ's congregation. So all of, and now, by the way, and I've mentioned this as well, that in their Ezekiel commentary, they have repudiated everything that they've written concerning Jerusalem being a type of Christendom. So you can throw all of that out the window, which is what I did many years ago. But concerning this 23rd chapter of Jeremiah, it would behoove all of Jehovah's Witnesses to read that entire chapter, because it starts off with a denunciation of God's shepherds, his elders. Woe to the shepherds who are destroying and scattering the sheep of my pasture, declares Jehovah. Now, before you discard this as having no relevance whatsoever for Jehovah's Witnesses, scan on down in that very same 23rd chapter. And when God begins to execute his judgment, notice in verse 20, the anger of Jehovah will not turn back until he has carried out and accomplished the intentions of his heart. Okay. When is that? In the final part of the days, you will clearly understand this. And the reason Jehovah's Witnesses do not clearly understand this is because the final part of the days has not begun. We are not deep into the time of the end. The time of the end has not begun. The conclusion of the system has not begun. The harvest has not taken place. But when it does, God's sheep will be scattered, thus bringing upon them this woe. And you can find the same denunciation throughout the prophecies. For example, in Ezekiel. And by the way, the Watchtower used to say that those shepherds who lost God's sheep in Ezekiel were the political shepherds, that somehow God entrusted his sheep to the likes of, Hitler and all these tyrants. But Jehovah is really taking his elders to task, that they have been tyrannical with his people. And even up to this point, well, as he goes on to say in the second verse, therefore this is what Jehovah, the God of Israel, says against the shepherds who are shepherding my people. You have scattered my sheep. You kept dispersing them, and you have not turned your attention to them. So I will turn my attention to you because of your evil deeds. In Ezekiel, Jehovah takes them to task. He says, you've not bandaged the wounded one. You've not looked for the lost one. How many of Jehovah's Witnesses and persons who are studying have been stumbled, have become shoved out of the congregation, really? How many people have wished to be baptized and they were prevented from doing so by the elders because they wouldn't accept something like 1914? I can tell you it's a considerable number. Persons who have a love for God, who are his sheep from his reckoning, and they're dispersed. Well, consider verse 3. I will gather together the remnant of my sheep from all the lands to which I have dispersed them. Jehovah's taking credit for dispersing. I will bring them back to their pasture, and they will be fruitful and become many. And I will raise up over them shepherds, plural, who will really shepherd them. And they will no longer be afraid or terrified, and none will be missing. Well, if Jehovah's Witnesses represent this gathering, then that means God considers the shepherds of the clergy of Christendom to be his shepherds? He says, you're shepherds, you're shepherding my people, and you've scattered my sheep. The fact is, Jesus has not begun reigning. The sprout of David has not come. He's been ruling over his congregation, but he has not become king of the world. And that's when this scattering will take place. Didn't Jesus speak of a great gathering during the conclusion? The angels will blow the trumpet and gather the chosen from the four winds. Well, I've spoken about, I think the prophecy of Joel is really the linchpin. It's the key to understanding all prophecies because it speaks about God's house coming under this onslaught of the locusts. They devour the harvest, and the storehouses have to be torn down. There's no more grain. It's speaking about the end of the preaching. And the sheep and the cattle are the ones that bear the brunt of God's denunciation. And the priests and the elders are called upon to come into the house of Jehovah and supplicate for his favor. Well, Jeremiah speaks about the same devastation. In verse 10, the land is full of adulterers. Because of the curse, the land is gone into mourning, and the pastures of the wilderness have dried up. Their course is evil, and they abuse their power. Both the prophet and the priest are polluted. Even in my house I have found their wickedness, declares Jehovah. So their path will become slippery and dark, and they will be pushed and fall, for I will bring calamity on them in the year of reckoning. Well, yeah, it's said in this ancient time of Baal worship, but we still have the same dynamic at play now, don't we? Satan is still prowling around, roving about, influencing Jehovah's worshipers into a wrong course, into spiritual adultery and idolatry, worship of this Watchtower organization, and they have abused their power. There's no question about that. Both the priest and the prophet are polluted, and in my house I found their wickedness. In God's house. That's the spiritual house. So this is what Jesus will find when he comes to inspect. He will find this polluted condition, this wickedness, which, by the way, is why Jesus comes as a launderman to take care of this uncleanness. It's why he comes with the fire of a refiner to purge his people of their scummy dross, their haughtiness, their overconfidence. The prophet and the priest are polluted. So, as I mentioned, the Watchtower claims to be a prophet. But notice what Jehovah says about these men who are prophets. Therefore, this is what Jehovah of armies says against the prophets. Here I am making them eat wormwood and giving them poisoned water to drink. For from the prophets of Jerusalem, apostasy has spread throughout the land. The apostasy must come first. Didn't the Apostle Paul say that? Jerusalem being a symbol of Christ's congregation. This is what Jehovah of armies says. Do not listen to the words of the prophets who are prophesying to you. They are deluding you. Didn't Paul speak about the deluding influence that emanates from a man of lawlessness who is part of an operation of Satan? The vision they speak is from their own heart, not from the mouth of Jehovah. What is the vision of theirs? That all of the prophecies for good have been fulfilled. We're in spiritual paradise. Christ came in 1914. He's bestowed his blessing upon the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. Let's go on. Verse 17. They're saying again and again to those who disrespect me, Jehovah has said, you will enjoy peace. And to everyone who follows his own stubborn heart, they say, no calamity will come upon you. For who has stood in the inner circle of Jehovah to see and hear his word? Who has paid attention to his word in order to hear it? Well, the Watchtower claims, yeah, we understand all of these things. Who is as blind as a servant of Jehovah? It's a case of seeing many things. You didn't keep watching. It's a case of opening your ears, but you didn't listen. Who has paid attention to his word in order to hear it? Look, the windstorm of Jehovah will burst out in fury. The Watchtower says, no, there can't be another world war that will mark the beginning of the time of the end with the Spanish flu and all that. That's a unique fingerprint. Cannot be duplicated. Can't be fulfilled in any greater measure. But it will. And that's why in the final part of the days you will clearly understand it. Oh, God goes on to say, I did not send the prophets, yet they ran. I did not speak to them, yet they prophesied. How true. How true. Well, this is interesting if we go on down. God says he's against the prophets of lying dreams who relate them and lead my people astray because of their lies and their boasting. Well, that's the leadership of the Watchtower, dead to rights, is it not? So in verse 33, it says, when this people or a prophet or a priest ask you, what is the burden of Jehovah? You should reply to them, you people are the burden, and I will cast you off. And as for the prophet or the priest or the people who say, this is the burden of Jehovah, I will turn my attention on that man and on his household. Well, we know how it ended for the Jews in Jerusalem. Of course, God brought them back, which is what Zechariah is speaking of, but it has a much broader meaning and application for the second coming of Christ. But before Christ bestows his glory upon God's chosen ones and ushers the approved into the kingdom, first, verse 39 says, look, I will lift you up and throw you away from my presence, both you and the city that I gave to you and your forefathers, and I will bring on you everlasting disgrace and everlasting humiliation, which will not be forgotten. Now, I know that all of you have read Jesus' words many, many times. The so-called Olivet sermon, his discourse when he was on the Mount of Olives, and when his disciples asked him, tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your presence and the conclusion? And you know the many things that Jesus outlined. But what would you say was the most prominent feature, the thing that was of most interest to Jesus' apostles who were sitting there on the Mount of Olives listening to Jesus? No doubt it was when he spoke of Jerusalem being surrounded by encamped armies and the desolation of her. He said, know that the desolating of her has drawn near, and let those in Judea flee to the mountains. And why? Because these are days for meting out justice in order that all the things written may be fulfilled. All the things written in Ezekiel, in Jeremiah, for example, the 23rd chapter, which I just briefly considered. And then Jesus went on to say, woe to the pregnant woman, those nursing a baby in those days, for there will be great distress on the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled on by the nations until the appointed times of the nations are fulfilled. Well, According to the Watchtower, Jerusalem no longer is a type of Christendom. So what does this portend? Why don't you ask your elders and the governing body? They're the prophets and priests, right? Let them tell you what this means. Of course, they won't be able to tell you because they don't know. But in the final part of the days, you will understand. Thank you for listening. I hope to speak to you again tomorrow.